Hey everybody, we are back again for another 2021-2022 NHL season preview, and today we're going to be looking at the Arizona Coyotes. This is a team that certainly has had an interesting offseason, both as far as hockey-related things and off the ice, non-hockey related things with all the issues with the city, and we don't even know where they're going to be playing next season. So for this video, I'm going to take all that off-ice issues and throw that to the side, and we're going to be strictly looking at the team on the ice, the roster, and what to expect from them in the this year during the season and where their franchise is headed as far as a strictly hockey standpoint. And I don't think I'm alone in saying this. It's expected to be a pretty long year for the Coyotes this season. They do not have a very good roster. However, I will commend them for the amount of draft picks that they were able to acquire, and they are setting themselves up to potentially have a very strong future on the ice. So before we get fully into it, I just ask that you please subscribe and hit that thumbs up. It helps out a lot and is greatly appreciated. But let's get started here. And before we look forward, we have to look back. Last season, Arizona just missed out on the playoffs. They finished 5th in the West Division. 24, 26, and 6 on the season. 54 points. Like I said, 5th place finish. And honestly, they were just a very, very mediocre team last year. And we'll get more into that and where they could be headed and whatnot throughout the course of this video. But last year was just a very mediocre year. They could not score goals. This was not a good offensive team. They only scored 2.68 goals per game. Not nearly enough offense from this team last year to be an actual playoff team. And they also weren't that great defensively. For a team that was kind of supposed to be low scoring but win with defense, they gave up over 3 goals a game last year at 3.11 goals against per game. So just not great at either end of the ice for Arizona. However, their special teams were better than you would think. Their power play was actually pretty decent, especially for a team that scored as little as the Coyotes did. They still were 20.8% effective on the power play, which is not bad at all. And their penalty kill was pretty solid. It certainly wasn't great, but it was very solid at 80.8% on the PK. So their special teams were actually pretty good. Last year, again, just overall very, very mediocre season and a very middle-of-the-road team out in the West. And that brings us to this offseason, and boy, were there some changes made. I mean, look at the roster turnover here on both sides, the additions and the subtractions. In all of the season previews that I've done so far, and we're getting down to the last few teams here, no other team has even come close to having this many changes, this much roster turnover as far as the offseason is concerned. I mean, the sheer just amount of new players on this team and players that were here last year that are no longer here is just absolutely astounding. And I'm not even going to go through them all name by name. You guys can read through the list here while I'm talking, but it is a massive number of players changing for the Coyotes this season. And basically what their strategy was this offseason, and this is what I'm really going to commend the Coyotes for, is that they were not afraid to tear it down and start over. And this was a team that needed to do that. They'd been very mediocre, and they realized that being consistently mediocre gets you nowhere but mediocre. So they realized that they weren't good enough to actually contend. They needed to strip it down. They needed to start over. And what they did this offseason was they were willing to take on bad contracts from other teams that, those teams were desperately trying to get rid of, like Shane Gostisbehere, like Anton Strawman, like Andrew Ladd, like Eriksson, Beagle, and Roussel, all coming over from Vancouver. Those were contracts that those teams needed to get rid of. Arizona said, okay, we'll help you out. We'll take on those contracts. However, you're going to pay us for it in draft picks. And Arizona did a phenomenal job of acquiring a ton of assets in draft picks this offseason. First-round picks, second-round picks, third-round picks. I mean, they loaded up on draft picks that they now can use in their rebuild to probably rebuild fairly quickly as long as they draft well, or they can use some of those picks as assets in a trade and get some already established players or some high-level prospects via trade if they choose to go that route, or they can just keep the picks in draft, and if they draft well, they're going to get some incredibly talented young players into this organization, and it could be a fairly quick turnaround for the Coyotes if they stay on plan and stick with what they're doing, and if they use those draft assets properly. If they can do those two things, they could set themselves up for a very, very good future, which is why I think it was the right move to tear it down the way that they did, because with what Arizona had been doing, they were never going to be a true contending team. There may be a year or two here and there where they'd sneak into a playoff spot, but they'd always be a first or second round exit. And more often than not, they probably wouldn't even be making the playoffs. With the strategy that they have taken now, where they're loading up on these assets, they are setting themselves up to be, sure, absolutely terrible now. They're probably going to be fighting for the first overall pick this season. They're going to be a bottom 3 team in the league in all likelihood. But if they're willing to take that and be a bottom team for the next couple of years, they could be a great team 5 or 6 years down the line. And they really could be setting themselves up for some sustained success with some really, really good young players coming into their organization. Again, if they keep on track with what they're doing and if they draft well, that is, they're setting themselves up to be in position to be really successful long term while obviously undergoing a pretty tough rebuild right now. But there's no doubt about it, this team is not going to be very good this year. But it's not about this year for the Arizona Coyotes. It's about setting themselves up with good draft picks for the future and trying to rebuild this team and rebuild it properly so they can become a top team. And I give them a lot of credit for that. A lot of teams don't like to admit that they're not contenders. A lot of teams don't like to admit that they need to rebuild. Arizona was like, let's be realistic with where we are. We need to tear it down. We need to start over. And that's what they've done this offseason, and I give them a lot of credit for that. And sure, I think they're going to be a bottom 3 team in the league this year, and they're going to be right down there with Buffalo and probably Anaheim as the 3 worst teams, but they're setting themselves up long-term to have a much better future than just being a fringe playoff team that's mediocre and in the middle of their division fighting for a playoff spot. So we'll see how it all works out long-term, but I think they could be on a very good track for 5 or 6 years from now. Now it's time to take a look at my projected roster for the Coyotes this year, and obviously it's nothing special. I mean, up front you've got Phil Kessel, Clayton Keller, and Nick Schmaltz. Those are, real solid guys. But after that, I mean, Louis Eriksson, Andrew Ladd, those are 2 guys that were castaways on really bad contracts that they signed back in 2016. Dmitry Yaskin coming back over from playing in Europe. We'll see what he looks like. He actually lit it up in Europe after not really, he was with the Blues for a while and was decent, but could never really crack the top 6. Then he went over to Europe and actually played really well. We'll see what he looks like back in the NHL. Jay Beagle and Antoine Roussel, both castaways from Vancouver. Lawson Krause, power forward, who never really turned into the high-end power forward that he was expected to. Johan Larsson, Ryan Dzingel, Christian Fischer, Travis Boyd, all kind of depth players there. Yeah, not a lot to write home about on the roster right now. Jacob Chikrin, obviously their best defenseman. Really, really good young player. Like him a lot. Obviously, there's not much else there on the back end. Anton Strawman is a veteran guy who's really fallen off. Shane Gostisbehere, extremely inconsistent. Sometimes looks really good. Other times really, really struggles. Philadelphia needed to get rid of his contract. Arizona took it. Ilya Lyubushkin, he's a He's a depth guy. Connor Timmins coming over from Colorado. Now, Connor Timmins, I think, is a really interesting one because he is still very young and has a lot of upside potential. So he's definitely a guy to watch play a bigger role here in Arizona than he ever did or have a chance to in Colorado. Victor Soderstrom, another really young guy that I'm excited to see because I think he has a lot of upward potential as well. And then Kyle Capobianco, again, kind of a depth guy. I think him and Labushkin will kind of be fighting for playing time as one as the number 6 and one as the number 7. In goal, this is really bad. Carter Hutton and Joseph Coronar. Yeah, that's really bad. That might be the worst goaltending tandem in the NHL. I can't think of anything worse. Buffalo's is really bad with Craig Anderson and Aaron Dell, but I think Hutton and Coronar might be even worse than that. Unless Coronar turns into somebody that really steps his game up and becomes a really solid starter out of nowhere. Unless something like that happens, this is going to be really tough in goal for them. Obviously, Darcy Kemper, Antti Ranta, both gone. Aiden Hill's gone as well, so they got 2 completely new goaltenders, and neither of them are very good, or at least haven't been in the NHL. Carter Hutton's been awful since going to Buffalo. Coronar didn't really see a whole lot of in San Jose. We'll see. He'll definitely get more of a chance here in Arizona, but I don't have super high hopes. Depth guys, they've got Alex Galchenyuk on a PTO. We'll see if he gets a contract or not. Liam O'Brien, Hudson Fasching, Barrett Hayton, former very high first-round pick, hasn't really turned into anything. He's looking like a bust. Hopefully he can get his career back on track, but he's not even really a lock in the lineup at this point, so that's got to be worrisome. Liam Kirk just signed his ELC. He'll be an interesting guy to watch. I don't think he's going to make the team out of camp or anything, but he could be a guy that gets NHL games in the near future. On the back end, Cameron Crotty and Cole Hultz look like 2 pretty decent prospects on the back end for them, but they don't have a whole lot back there coming up. And as far as a third goaltender goes, I have no idea. They don't have anybody with any NHL experience in the system, so I mean, when your tandem is Carter Hutton and Joseph Coronar, you're not very deep in goal. And beyond those 2, they don't have anyone that even has sniffed the NHL. So, yeah, it's going to be a long year for the Coyotes, but that's to be expected. They're probably going to be a bottom team this year. Certainly finish last in their division, maybe finish last in the league, but with a finish like that becomes a great draft pick, and I think that's what the Coyotes are worried about right now, getting those high draft picks, loading up this system with some young talent, and then going from there, seeing if they can develop that talent into high-end NHL players, which will then take this team from the bottom to the top. So we'll see with Arizona. Definitely not expecting much this year. That roster is not very good. I mean, let's just face it. You can't even make an argument against that. Like you look at that roster compared to most teams in the NHL, and this is a really bad team right now. So it's all about the future for the Arizona Coyotes. That's what they're building for. They're loading up on draft picks, taking bad contracts, and trying to build for 5 years down the line versus building for right now. So we'll see how it all works out long term. We'll also see if they're in Arizona long term or not. That's a whole other side of this that has to be worked out over the next year or so. But as far as on the ice goes, that's my preview for Arizona this year. And hey, if maybe they'll get lucky, win the lottery, and get that first overall pick, and that could be a franchise-changing moment for this team if they do get that first overall pick. But with that, like, comment, share, subscribe, follow on social media. All those links are down in the description. If you'd like to further support the channel, our merch store, memberships, and donation link are down in the description as well. Keep spreading the word about this channel. Let's keep this thing growing. Thank you so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll talk to you guys soon.